I started at the Harwick County History Museum, the way most people start jobs. They didn't really choose, because something else fell through first. I'd been doing restoration work for a firm in the city, mostly private contracts, furniture and decorative pieces for estate sales, and the occasional historical property. Good work when it came in. Then it stopped coming in, which is a longer story, involving a partnership that dissolved badly, and some money that was owed to me and never arrived. I don't need to get into that. The point is, I was 41 years old, recently separated, renting a room above a hardware store in a town I'd driven through a dozen times without ever stopping, and I needed something that paid regularly and didn't require me to rebuild a professional network from scratch. The museum job was listed in the county paper, which I was reading on my phone at a diner counter because I'd run out of other things to do with a Tuesday morning. Collections and exhibits coordinator, which meant I was the person who took care of things. That was the whole job, when you got down to it. Making sure the objects were where they were supposed to be, in the condition they were supposed to be in, presented the way the museum's documentation said they should be presented. There were also some administrative duties: grant paperwork, donor correspondence, coordinating with the County Historical Society when they needed something. But mostly, I took care of things. I was good at that. The museum itself was small. 3 main gallery rooms, a storage wing, an administrative area that had once been a coat check, and a basement that held overflow inventory and the old town records the county had donated in 1987. The building was a former county courthouse, built in 1891, and it had that particular quality that old civic buildings in small towns often have: a kind of unearned grandeur. Ceilings too high for the rooms, woodwork more serious than the purpose required. It smelled like linseed oil and old paper, and something underneath that I never could name exactly. Not unpleasant, just old. The director was a woman named Patricia Chung, who had been running the museum for 11 years and who communicated primarily through written notes and a particular way of pressing her lips together when something displeased her. She was not unfriendly. She was efficient in the way that people become efficient when they've spent a decade doing 3 people's jobs with 1 person's budget. She showed me around on my first day, explained the systems, handed me a binder, and told me that the most important thing about the collection was documentation. If something moves, she said, write it down. Where it was, where it is now, when, why, every time. I said I understood. The donors are particular, she said. Some of these pieces have conditions attached. If the Halverson family donated something in 1962, it goes in the Halverson case. It stays in the Halverson case. It doesn't get relocated without written approval. That's not us being fussy. That's us honoring agreements. I said I understood that too. The museum had 4 full-time staff, including me, and 2 part-time weekend docents. Patricia handled administration and public relations. A man named Dwight Folger managed facilities. He was semi-retired, came in 3 days a week, handled the building maintenance, and anything that required physical effort beyond what I could manage alone. The 4th full-time staff was a woman named Renata Solis, who had been there 7 years and ran education programming, which mostly meant school group tours and the occasional community event. Renata was the person who actually knew the collection. She was the one who could tell you which case held the Civil War-era surveying equipment and why the Garfield-era farmhouse kitchen display was missing 1 butter churn that had been on loan to a university for a study about 19th century dairy practices and had not come back yet. She told me that last part on my 2nd day, while we were walking through the main gallery together. She had a habit of talking about the objects like she was updating me on mutual acquaintances. Matter of fact, familiar, without any performative enthusiasm. I liked her immediately. The life-size figures were her idea, she told me, not hers, originally. The museum had always had some mannequins for the period clothing displays, but the expansion of the living history section 3 years ago had been a project she'd developed and written the grant for. There were now 9 figures arranged across 2 rooms, dressed in period clothing from the museum's textile collection, posed to suggest everyday life in Harwick County across different eras. A figure in the front room was dressed in an 1880s postmaster's uniform, standing behind a replica sorting counter. In the second room, there were 2 figures posed near a reproduction of an early 20th century general store interior, one behind the counter, one in front of it, as if mid-transaction. 3 more in the far end of the second room represented a domestic scene, a family around a table set with period dishes. The remaining 3 were in the third gallery, which covered the mid-20th century, a factory worker in coveralls from the town's former tannery operation, a woman in a 1940s dress, seated at a desk with period office supplies, and a figure near the door dressed for the outdoors, like someone leaving for something. 9 figures. I learned them the way you learn anything in a new workplace, through repetition and small adjustments, checking that their displays were properly maintained, that the clothing hadn't shifted, that the cases and surrounding areas were clean. Renata had a specific sheet for each figure, a record of what they were wearing, what pieces belonged to which catalog entry, when each garment had last been inspected, and by whom. I was added to that process on my 2nd week. I would check the figures, note the date and my initials, and confirm the record matched the reality. It was the kind of work I found genuinely calming, systematic, clear. My room above the hardware store was fine for what it was: a bed, a table, a window that faced the back of another building. I cooked on a 2-burner stove and kept my wine in the small refrigerator next to the sink, and read before bed every night, like I had my whole adult life. I was not unhappy. That's a careful word to use, but it's the right one. I was not in a good period, but I wasn't suffering in the way people imagine when they picture a man alone in a rented room. I was getting through. I was doing the work. That was enough for where I was. My daughter, Marisol, was 17. She lived with her mother in a city 4 hours away. We talked on the phone twice a week, Sundays and Wednesdays, and I drove out to see her 1 weekend a month when I could manage it. The separation had been civil, which is a way of saying it had been careful, both of us being very deliberate about not breaking anything more than what was already broken. Marisol handled it with a steadiness that I found both admirable and quietly devastating. The kind of steadiness kids develop when they've been watching 2 adults manage something badly for long enough that they've learned to prepare themselves. She'd asked me, when I told her about the museum job, if I liked it. Not whether it was good or whether it would work out. Whether I liked it. I said I did. Which was true. I liked the building. I liked the work. I liked the particular quiet of a small institution, where the same people were in the same rooms every day, and everyone knew the state of things. I'd spent years in environments where the work was always contingent on someone else's decision. This was different. The things in the museum existed on their own terms. My job was to maintain what was already there. I'd been working at Harwick County History Museum for 11 weeks when the first thing happened. It was a Thursday, late October, but still warm enough that I'd come in that morning without a jacket, just a flannel shirt, dark green with a thin tan stripe, one I'd had for years. I remember it specifically because of what came after, so I've thought about it enough times that the memory has taken on a slightly unreal quality, the way repeated memories do. But I'm reasonably certain about the shirt. I'd had a longer morning than usual. There was a grant report due at the end of the month, and Patricia had asked me to pull some inventory figures together for an appendix, which meant going through catalog records in a way that required actual concentration rather than the pleasant autopilot of my regular rounds. I worked at my desk until about 11:30, then went to do my figure check before lunch because I'd missed my usual morning window. I went through the rooms in my standard order. Front gallery first, the postmaster. Second gallery, the general store figures. Then the domestic scene group. I checked the record sheets, noted the condition of each display, initialed the log. Everything where it should be. In the third gallery, I checked the tannery worker first, then the office woman at her desk, and then I walked to the far end of the room, toward the figure near the door. The outdoor figure, the one that had always looked to me like someone about to leave. And I stopped. The figure was wearing a dark green flannel shirt with a thin tan stripe through it. I stood there looking at it for what was probably 15 seconds, but felt considerably longer. The shirt was the exact color, the exact pattern. I could see the buttons, which were the same small, dark buttons. The flannel had the same slightly worn texture at the collar that mine did. I looked down at myself, then back at the figure. My first thought was that I was seeing a coincidence. Flannel shirts in that color combination were common enough. Mine wasn't unusual. Any outdoor supply store carried something similar. My second thought almost immediately, which is probably what I should pay attention to in retrospect, was to check the record sheet. The record sheet for that figure was on a clipboard hanging from a small hook on the wall beside the display, the same as all the others. I walked to it and looked at the clothing description. Under the figure's logged garments, wool blend trousers in dark brown, leather boots, cream-colored long underwear shirt, and, listed at the top, an overcoat in charcoal gray. No flannel shirt listed. The figure was supposed to be wearing a charcoal gray overcoat as its primary visible layer. I looked at the figure again. No overcoat. Dark green flannel with a thin tan stripe. I went and found Renata. She was in the education room, working on something on her computer, and she looked up when I came in. "The outdoor figure in 3, I said. "Can you come take a look?" She could tell from my voice that it wasn't a maintenance question. She came. She stood next to me and looked at the figure for a moment, then looked at the record sheet. She did this a couple of times. Then she looked at me with an expression that I would describe as measured. She was thinking through explanations, working the same problem I had. "That's not the overcoat," she said. "No. And the overcoat isn't on the figure. No." She checked the display case area, the space around the figure, the nearby walls. The overcoat was a significant piece. It was mid-19th century, documented as having belonged to a county commissioner. It wasn't hanging anywhere. It wasn't folded in the case. "Dwight might have moved something for a maintenance reason," she said. "He sometimes shifts things when he's doing work on the walls or the floor." And replaced it with a different garment. She pressed her lips together in a way that reminded me of Patricia. "No," she said. "That doesn't make sense." We went to Dwight, who had been in that morning replacing a fluorescent tube in the basement stairwell and was about to leave for the day. He hadn't touched anything in Gallery 3. He hadn't been in Gallery 3 at all. We checked with Patricia. She hadn't authorized any changes. She hadn't been informed of any. The overcoat was ultimately found 2 days later, folded in the storage wing in a flat archive drawer that was used for large textile pieces. It was in good condition, properly folded, no damage. No note explaining why it was there. The flannel shirt on the figure, the one that looked like mine, we couldn't account for. It wasn't in the museum's catalog, not the textile catalog, not the general inventory. Not any acquisition record Renata could find going back to when the collection started. It was simply on the figure, and there was no record of it ever having arrived. Patricia filed a discrepancy report. Renata re-examined all the other figures to make sure nothing else was misattributed. I documented everything I'd observed, what the figure had been wearing, when I'd noticed it, what the record sheet said, where the overcoat was ultimately found. We were all professional about it. The working theory, the one that didn't require us to say something that sounded strange, was that someone had made an unauthorized change, possibly a previous employee with access, or a cleaning crew that had exceeded their remit, and that the discrepancy had simply gone unnoticed until now. I kept that explanation for a while. It was reasonable. It cost nothing. I did not, in my documentation, note that the shirt was the same color and pattern as the one I was wearing that morning. That detail felt irrelevant, or I told myself it felt irrelevant. But I'd noticed. And once I'd noticed, I couldn't make myself stop thinking about the fact that I'd noticed. That Sunday, I called Marisol, and she told me about a paper she was writing, and a friend she'd argued with, and a film she'd watched and thought I might like. I told her about the museum, the building, some of the collection pieces I'd been cataloging. I didn't mention the figure. There was nothing to tell, technically. A shirt that looked like mine on a mannequin in a history museum. That wasn't a story. That was a detail with no weight to it yet. Except it stayed with me, in the way that things stay when part of you is already keeping a file it hasn't told the rest of you about. That night, I hung my green flannel shirt over the chair beside my bed, as I usually did with clothes I intended to wear again. I looked at it for a moment before I turned off the light. I don't know what I expected it to do. It just hung there, a shirt on a chair. The same as always. I went to sleep. The next week was ordinary enough that I almost let it go. Almost. The overcoat went back on the figure. Renata had dry cleaned it as a precaution and documented the process. And on the Monday after the incident, I watched her dress the figure properly and update the record sheet herself. The unnamed flannel shirt was tagged as an unattributed acquisition, pending investigation, and placed in a clear archive bag in the storage wing. Patricia sent an email to the County Historical Society asking if they had any record of a textile donation that might have been misdirected. Nobody responded with anything useful. I checked the figures every morning that week. Same as always. Same order. Same clipboard. Same initials. Everything stayed where it was supposed to be. By Friday, I'd built enough of a routine around normalcy that the incident had started to feel like the kind of strange thing that happens in old institutions, some inexplicable administrative residue from a handoff nobody documented properly, a garment that arrived with a mislabeled box, an overcoat relocated by someone who had since forgotten doing it. Things like that accumulate in museums. I'd seen stranger, unexplained objects in my restoration work. A frame with no corresponding canvas. An inventory sticker on a piece that post-dated the inventory by 20 years. Bureaucratic ghosts. I knew how to file those away. What I could not file away, and I'm being honest about this because it's the part I kept talking myself out of, was the color. I'd told myself the shirt was a common enough pattern, but I knew my own shirts. I'd bought that particular one at an outdoor supply liquidator 6 years ago, and I'd never seen the same color combination on a rack since. The green was specific, a little grayed, a little muted. Not forest, not olive, just that exact green. And the stripe was narrow and tan, not cream, not yellow, tan. I kept not saying this out loud, which probably tells you something. The second incident happened on a Wednesday, 11 days after the first. I'd come in that morning wearing a pair of dark corduroys I almost never wore to work. Brown, A slightly worn left knee from where I'd caught it on a corner of my workbench back when I still had a workbench. I'd worn them because my usual trousers were still damp from washing. Minor domestic decision. Completely unremarkable. My morning rounds were normal through the first 2 galleries. I got to the 3rd gallery and started with the tannery worker, which I always did, because the display was farthest from the door, and I worked my way back toward the entrance. I got to the office woman at the desk, noted her condition on the sheet, walked to the outdoor figure. The overcoat was back, properly dressed, collar positioned correctly, buttons aligned the way Renata had fastened them. Underneath the overcoat visible at the lower hem, below the coat's bottom edge, were trouser legs, dark corduroy, brown, slightly worn at one knee. I did not move for a moment. Then I walked to the record sheet. The outdoor figure's listed garments: overcoat in charcoal gray, wool blend trousers in dark brown, leather boots, cream-colored long underwear shirt. No corduroys listed. The figure was supposed to be wearing wool blend trousers. Plain, smooth weave, not corduroy. I went back and looked at the visible portion of the trouser legs. The corduroy texture was clear, and on the left knee, facing outward, there was a faint worn patch that caught the light differently than the surrounding fabric. I stood there doing math I didn't want to finish. I went and got Renata immediately this time, without deliberating. She came, looked at the record sheet, looked at me. Her expression was different from the first time, less like problem solving, more careful. "That's not the wool trousers," she said. "No." She reached toward the figure's coat hem, and then stopped herself and looked at me. "Can I just confirm that these aren't—" She started the sentence and didn't finish it. "I'm wearing corduroy today," I said. "Brown. I've got a worn patch on the left knee of mine." We looked at each other. "That's probably a coincidence," she said. She said it the way you say things you need to be true for the room to keep feeling normal. "Probably," I said. She documented it the same way we documented the first incident: new garment, no catalog entry. Listed trousers, not on the figure. She photographed everything. We searched for the wool blend trousers in the storage wing and found them in the same flat archive drawer where the overcoat had turned up the first time. Folded correctly, no damage. Same drawer, different day. This time I told Patricia about the similarity to my clothing. She listened carefully. She had the quality of a person who processes difficult information by keeping her face very still. When I finished, she said, "Are you suggesting someone is doing this deliberately? Sourcing clothing to match what you wear to work?" "I'm suggesting it's happened twice, and both times the garment resembles something I wore that day." "That's a very difficult thing to prove," she said. "I know. And it would imply that someone either has access to this building after hours, or has access during open hours without our knowledge." "Yes." "I'll review the entry log," she said. "We have a sign-in sheet for the public entrance and a keycard record for staff. I'll look at both." She reviewed them that afternoon. On both dates, the Thursday of the first incident and the Wednesday of the second, there was nothing anomalous in the keycard log. My entry in the morning, Renata's, Dwight's, on the days he came in, Patricia's. The public entrance sign-in sheet was the usual sparse trickle of afternoon visitors. No one after closing. The building alarm had not been triggered on either night. She showed me the logs. I looked at them for a while. "Is there another way in?" I asked. Dwight was the one who answered that when we found him later in the afternoon. He thought about it with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who'd been responsible for a building long enough to know its habits. There were 3 exterior doors. 2 were alarmed. The third, a service entrance off the east side, originally a prisoner transfer door from the building's courthouse days, had been alarmed until 3 years ago, when the alarm panel was replaced during a renovation, and Dwight had not gotten around to reconnecting that one sensor to the new panel. He said this with the expression of a man who had now made a decision about where the rest of his month was going. "I'll reconnect it this week," he said. "Is it locked?" I asked. "Deadbolt and knob lock, both." "Can it be opened without a key from the outside?" "It'd need a key," he said. "Standard cylinder, but I don't know how many copies exist. That lock's been there since before my time." So there was a possible entry point. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was the beginning of a framework. I could stand inside someone with an old key. Some inexplicable purpose, access to garments that matched things I wore, a person. That was easier than the alternative, which I hadn't said to anyone yet. I owned both shirts, the green flannel, the brown corduroy trousers. Both were in my room above the hardware store. The flannel was in my closet. The trousers were in my laundry bag. Neither had been taken. Neither was missing, which meant that whatever was appearing on the figure wasn't my clothing. It was clothing that looked exactly like mine. I drove home that evening and stood in my room looking at my own clothes for longer than I should probably admit. The brown corduroys were in the bag where I'd put them that morning before changing into clean ones. The green flannel was on its hanger, both exactly where I'd left them, both unambiguously mine. Somewhere on a mannequin in a third-floor gallery, there were garments that matched them with a precision I couldn't explain through coincidence. Not once, twice. I called Marisol that Sunday, and again I didn't mention it. I didn't know how. I kept finding the edge of it in the conversation and stepping back. She asked if everything was okay, and I said yes. Mostly. Just settling in still. She said settling took time. She was right. The thing I've had difficulty conveying to the two people I've eventually told about this is how much I continued to work normally through all of it. I know that sounds strange, but the work was real and the work was good, and it didn't stop being either of those things, because something I couldn't account for was happening at the edge of it. I kept doing my rounds. I kept updating records. I helped Renata prepare for a school group visit. I wrote 3 sections of the grant report appendix. The days still had the ordinary texture of days. But I also started paying attention to the outdoor figure in a way I hadn't before. I don't mean I was watching it obsessively. I mean, I was watching it as a professional exercise, the way you watch anything that requires monitoring. I noted what it was wearing at the beginning and end of each day. I photographed it. I compared the photographs. I did this quietly and didn't tell anyone. I also started paying attention to what I wore each morning, not in a frightened way. Methodically, I began keeping a note in my phone brief, just a record. Date, what I put on. Nothing more. I did it the way you'd log any variable in an investigation. If something happened again, I wanted an unambiguous record of what I'd been wearing, time-stamped and logged before I arrived at the museum. The third incident happened 18 days after the second. I had gone to work in the middle of a run of ugly weather, 3 days of hard rain, and I'd worn a waterproof pullover I'd bought the previous spring. Burnt orange, which was a color I'd not intentionally gravitated toward before, but had liked when I saw it on the rack. Not a common garment. Not the kind of thing you'd see duplicated by accident. And I'd worn it into the museum in the morning with my hood down and hung it on the hook beside my desk and forgotten about it for most of the day. I found it on the figure that afternoon during my end-of-day check. Except this time the figure wasn't wearing only the additional garment. The charcoal gray overcoat was still there. The orange pullover was visible at the collar and wrist openings underneath the coat, layered beneath it. Just the cuffs and the neck visible. The way you'd layer a pullover under a coat on a cold day. the way I'd been wearing mine under my jacket that morning. And on the left cuff, just visible where the sleeve emerged from the overcoat sleeve, there was a small iron-on patch, circular, blue and white, a small sailing vessel. Marisol had given it to me 2 Christmases ago as part of a set of patches she'd bought at a craft fair. She'd ironed 3 of them onto different things of mine as a joke gift. She knew I kept things until they fell apart, and she thought it was funny to make them more obviously mine. I'd been meaning to replace the cuff where the patch was because the pullover was fraying there, but I hadn't gotten around to it. The patch on the figure's wrist was circular, blue and white, a small sailing vessel. I stood there for a long time. I photographed everything. Then I went to the record sheet and looked at it, and I did the thing I'd been doing, noting the discrepancy, which was significant and clear. And then I went back and stood in front of the figure one more time before I left for the day. I looked at its face. Mannequin faces in small museums are not sophisticated. This one was a generic molded form, painted features, glass eyes that were slightly too large and slightly too settled in the face to read as fully human, but close enough at a distance to register as a person. It was looking toward the door, the way it always was. The direction the figure was oriented was toward the exit, had always been toward the exit, as if it was posed in the moment before leaving. I'd looked at it a dozen times before. I'd always read its posture as generic period staging. Someone leaving for work, or leaving for the winter, or leaving for wherever people in historical museum displays are supposed to be going. That afternoon, with the orange pullover cuffs visible at its wrists and the blue and white patch facing forward, I looked at it differently. It wasn't leaving. Or, it wasn't only leaving. It was dressed as me. I locked up and drove to the hardware store and sat in my car in the parking lot for about 15 minutes, doing nothing in particular. The rain was still going. I watched it run down the windshield. My pullover was on the hook beside my desk. I'd confirmed it on the way out. My pullover was there. The one on the figure was not mine. It was an exact copy, including a patch that was specific to me, that Marisol had put there with her own hands, that I had never told another person about because it was a small, private detail of ownership, the kind that accumulates on objects you keep for years. No one at that museum had ever seen me wear that pullover before today. And no one could have known about the patch from looking at me, because I'd worn the pullover under a jacket, and the cuffs had been inside my jacket sleeves all morning. Someone had been inside my room. Or something had. I checked my room that night with the same methodical attention I'd been giving the figure. Not frantically. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's an impulse when telling this kind of story to make everything feel more dramatic than it actually was in the moment. The truth is, I went through the room the way I would have checked a damaged piece before cataloging it, starting with the obvious, moving to the detailed. Door lock, window latch, the small bathroom with its single frosted pane. Nothing forced, nothing broken. The window above the hardware store's rear alley was locked from the inside, the same way I always left it. I checked my clothing. Everything accounted for. The orange pullover on its hook, the patch on the left cuff exactly where Marisol had ironed it, my green flannel in the closet, the brown corduroys in the drawer where I'd refold them after washing. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed in any way I could identify. I sat at my table with a glass of wine and thought about the patch. The patch was the thing I kept returning to. Everything else, the colors, the patterns, the wear marks, those could theoretically be explained by someone observant. Someone who had watched me at the museum on multiple days, noted what I wore, sourced garments that matched. Difficult, specific, inexplicable in terms of motive. but at least theoretically possible within a rational framework. But the patch was different. The patch had been hidden under a jacket sleeve all morning. No one at the museum had seen it. No one could have seen it without being closer to me than anyone had been that day, unless they'd seen it before. Elsewhere. I went to the window and looked down at the alley. Sodium light, wet pavement, a dumpster, a cat or something that moved behind it. Ordinary. I stayed there for a while. The hardware store owner, a man named Gareth, lived 2 floors below me. He was the only person with another key to my room, for emergencies, which he'd mentioned when I moved in with the comfortable vagueness of a man who'd never expected it to become relevant. I'd had no interaction with him beyond paying rent on the first of the month, and occasionally exchanging a few minutes of conversation when we passed each other on the stairs. He was 60, wide, unhurried, and seemed genuinely disinterested in me in the way of people who have rented rooms for many years, and learned that caring about tenants is an investment with poor returns. I didn't seriously consider him. I considered him for about 30 seconds, and then discarded it. Not because people can't surprise you, they can, but because nothing about the situation suggested a local hardware store owner's involvement in whatever this was. I also considered that I might be wrong about the patch, that I might be misremembering the cuff detail, or that the figure's sleeve had shown something that looked like a patch from a distance in poor light, and my brain had filled in the specifics I was primed to see. Memory is not a recording. I'd thought about that enough during my years in restoration work, how often a client remembered a piece differently than it actually was, how often you had to gently correct a firmly held recollection against documentary evidence. So the next morning, I went in early and looked again before anyone else arrived. The patch on the figure's cuff was real. Blue and white, circular sailing vessel, slightly irregular at the edge where it had been heat applied to fabric that didn't lie perfectly flat. It was real, and it was detailed, and my brain had not invented it. I photographed it close up that morning with the overhead light on. When I looked at the photo later on my phone and compared it to a photo I took of my own cuff, they were the same image in every particular, except that in the museum photograph, the surrounding fabric was a shade less faded, and the fraying I'd been meaning to repair on mine was absent. My cuff had age on it. The figure's cuff did not. The garment on the figure was new, or newer than mine. It was a copy, not a theft, and it was a copy of something that had a specific personal detail no one could have obtained without having seen the original up close. I told Renata everything that morning. I showed her the photos side by side. I told her about the patch and how it had been under my sleeve all of the previous day. I told her I'd checked my room and found nothing disturbed. She listened with her full attention, which was one of the things I'd come to trust about her. She didn't interrupt and she didn't offer reassurances while I was still talking. When I finished, she said, "You need to tell Patricia the patch detail." I know, because that changes the category of what we're reporting. If the first incident was a garment discrepancy, this is something targeted at you specifically. Yes, she paused. Do you have any idea who might? No, I said. I've been through it. I can't identify a person. Patricia's response to the full account was careful and somewhat formal, which I understood. She was responsible for a public institution, and what I was describing had implications she had to manage carefully. She said she would contact local law enforcement and file a report. She also said she was going to arrange for a locksmith to assess all entry points, and she would personally review the security logs with Dwight for anything she might have missed. She did all of those things. The officer who came was pleasant and thorough, and wrote everything down and said it sounded like harassment, possibly stalking adjacent, and that without physical evidence of entry, the investigation options were limited. but they would keep the report on file. None of it helped me understand anything. I kept the log on my phone. I started noting not just what I wore, but what was visible and what was concealed, which items were under other items, what could be seen by someone watching me, and what couldn't. I did this without explaining to myself exactly what I was testing. I think I already knew, on some level, that it wasn't going to matter. That visibility was not the operative mechanism, but I needed to run the experiment because the alternative was accepting something I wasn't ready to accept. 2 more incidents in the following 3 weeks. The second was a gray knit sweater, unremarkable except for a small pulled thread at the hem on the right side that I'd been ignoring for months. The pulled thread appeared on the figures version. The fourth was a canvas work shirt, the pocket flap of which I'd repaired myself, with brown thread that didn't quite match the original, the kind of repair you make when you don't want to throw something out yet. The figures version had the same mismatched pocket flap, repaired the same way, same thread color. Both items had been worn under outer layers, the details invisible from any external vantage. After the 4th incident, I stopped sleeping well. Not dramatically. I wasn't lying awake terrified. It was more that I'd wake at around 3 in the morning, which I'd never done before, and lie in the quiet of the room with the particular quality of alertness that is less about fear and more about the brain refusing to stop working a problem it can't solve. I'd lie there and go through the same circuits. No one had accessed my room. My clothing was intact. Someone or something was producing exact replicas of garments worn close to my body, with wear and repair details that could not be observed without proximity, and placing them on a figure in a museum gallery every 2 to 3 weeks. The outdoor figure. Always the outdoor figure. Always dressed as me, always looking toward the door. One morning, approximately 6 weeks after the first incident, I arrived to find the figure had been repositioned. It was subtle. The figure's orientation was 3 or 4 degrees different. The angle of the shoulders, the direction of the glass eyes. It was still facing roughly toward the door, but slightly differently. Turned, almost, rather than facing, as if it had been looking somewhere else and had not quite returned to its original position. I checked the photographs I'd been keeping. The original orientation was clear in every image I'd taken over the previous weeks. The shift was real. I measured it. I got a compass and measured the angle, noted it, documented it with photographs, updated the file I'd been keeping on my laptop, a separate file from my official museum documentation, a private one. The official record I was required to maintain said only what could be reported as factual discrepancy, garment irregularities, undocumented items, dates, and times. The private file said everything else. The private file was getting longer. I drove to the city on the 2nd Saturday of that month to see Marisol. We went to a market in the morning and then to a film in the afternoon, a light comedy she'd been wanting to see, and I sat in the dark theater beside her and laughed at the things that were funny and held on to the ordinary reality of her presence in a way I hope she didn't notice because I didn't want to explain it. She was 17 and healthy and working out what her life was going to be, and she didn't need her father holding on to her in a movie theater because he'd lost his footing on what was real. On the drive home that night, I thought about the word real. The garments were real. I could touch them. The patch was real. The mismatched thread was real. The shift in the figure's position was measurable and documented. None of it was ambiguous in the way that hallucinations are ambiguous. There was no question of whether Renata and Patricia had seen the same things I had. They had. The records confirmed it. What was not real, in any framework I could make work, was the mechanism. I got back to my room and opened my laptop, and read through the private file from the beginning. I'd been adding to it irregularly since the second incident, and reading it straight through gave it a shape that the individual entries didn't have on their own. What I saw in that shape was an escalation, but it wasn't an escalation of frequency. The incidents were still spaced 2 to 3 weeks apart. The escalation was in specificity. Each replicated garment was closer to me than the last. The first items had been things I wore on the outside, visible to anyone. The subsequent items had been worn in layers, with details hidden. Each time, the details that appeared on the figure were the kind that required intimate access, wear patterns from contact, repairs made with my own hands, a patch applied as a private joke between me and my daughter. The figure was not being dressed in things that looked like mine. It was being dressed in things that knew me. I sat with that for a long time, and then I did something I'm a little embarrassed about now. Not because it was irrational, but because it was the first moment I acted on the thing I'd been refusing to name. I went to my closet and I pushed the clothes aside, and I looked at the back wall of the closet, the way you look at something when you don't know what you're looking for. Plaster, painted beige, a small water stain from some old leak, crescent-shaped, at the upper left. Nothing. I knocked on the wall. Solid. I knocked along it in sections like a doctor percussing a chest. All the same. No hollow sound, no cavity. I checked under the bed, behind the refrigerator, inside the cabinet above the bathroom sink. Nothing. No cameras I could find. No monitoring equipment. Nothing that shouldn't have been there. The room was what it appeared to be, a spare square of space, with old plumbing and thin walls and nothing watching from the corners, which left me with the thing I'd been pushing to the edge of every reasonable thought since the patch. I'd been treating this as a problem of access. Someone accessing my room, accessing the museum, accessing my clothing. But the clothing was never taken. The garments on the figure were copies, perfect copies, with perfect knowledge of details that couldn't be derived from observation of me at any distance. The question was not how someone was getting into my room. The question was how something knew what was in it. How it knew what was against my body. How it knew what Marisol's hands had touched. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a while. The room was quiet. The hardware store's rear alley was quiet. After a while, I heard the cat again, or something, moving below the window. I had a thought I pushed away, that the figure was not meant to be someone leaving, that it was dressed in my clothing and facing the door because it was meant to be me, arriving, or because whatever was dressing it was watching the door to know when I did. In the morning, I went in early again, and stood in front of the figure for a long time before the others arrived. I looked at its face, the painted features, the glass eyes that were still not quite pointing at me, still angled slightly from where they'd shifted, and I realized there was something I'd been documenting for weeks and hadn't examined as a question. Every time a new garment appeared, the previous one was gone. The figure was never wearing accumulating layers of my clothing. It was always wearing one item that matched mine over the correct period costume. The others were always found folded in the archive drawer, returned, as if there was a reason to keep only one at a time, as if there was a rotation. I went to the archive drawer and opened it. The folded garments were there, the ones that had been removed from the figure over the previous weeks. The gray knit sweater, the canvas work shirt. I counted them. 4 garments returned, including the first 2, the flannel and the corduroys. I looked at them for a while. Then I lifted the gray knit sweater and turned it over in my hands. On the hem, right side, there was a pulled thread, but it was longer than mine, stretched further, as if someone had continued what I'd been leaving undone. as if it had been worn, not just copied, but worn. And the wearing had continued the deterioration. I set it down carefully and stepped back from the drawer. I closed the drawer and stood there with my hands at my sides. The pulled thread was longer. I was certain of it. I'd looked at that sweater close enough, photographed it close enough, that I wasn't misremembering the detail. When it had come off the figure and been folded into the drawer, the thread had been the same length as mine, which was what I'd documented, what the photographs confirmed. Now it was longer, which meant either the sweater had been taken out of the drawer and worn and returned, or something had continued degrading it in place, in a closed drawer, folded flat, with no tension applied. I picked it up again and looked at the thread carefully. It was pulled cleanly, the way a thread pulls when fabric is stressed against something a rough surface, a catch, repeated motion, not cut, not frayed from age, pulled. I photographed it. I compared it to the photograph I'd taken when the sweater first came off the figure. The thread in the new photograph was approximately twice the length of the thread in the old one. I put the sweater back, closed the drawer, and went to my desk. I sat down. I had 40 minutes before Renata arrived. I thought about what it would mean to tell someone. Not Patricia. I'd already made the calculation about what Patricia could usefully do with information, and the answer was administrative action against a problem that was not administrative. Not the police officer who'd taken my harassment report, who had been thorough and kind and entirely unequipped. Renata was the only person in my immediate orbit who had been present for enough of it to hold the weight of a new detail without needing the whole architecture rebuilt first. But even Renata I ran through what I would say. The thread is longer than it was, and she would look at the photographs and she would think about deterioration and storage, about her own certainty of the original length, about the ways memory can adjust measurements after the fact. She was a precise person. She would want to be certain before she was alarmed, and I understood that. I had the same instinct, but I was already on the other side of that threshold. I knew what I knew. When she came in, I said good morning and asked about her weekend, and did not mention the drawer. Not yet. I needed one more day with it. One more day of looking at it myself. That afternoon, I stayed late under the pretext of the grant report. Patricia left at 5:15, Renata at 5:30. I heard Dwight lock the service wing at 5:45 and call out that he was heading. I said goodnight from my desk and listened to the side door close. The building settled into the particular quiet it had after everyone left. Old buildings do that, not silence exactly, but a withdrawal of human ambient noise that makes the structure's own sounds more present. The heat moving through old pipes, the wood responding to temperature. I'd been alone in the building before, on late days, and the sounds were familiar enough. I went back to the storage wing and opened the archive drawer again. I lifted each garment and examined it in the better light of the storage wing's overhead fluorescence. The gray sweater with its extended thread. The canvas work shirt, I turned it to the pocket flap and looked at the repair. The brown thread I'd used, which didn't match the original, was there. But the repair on the museum version was slightly different from mine. On mine, I'd done 4 overstitches in a small square pattern, because that's the way my mother had taught me to anchor a repair. On the museum version, the stitches were the same thread, the same color, but there were 5, a slightly different hand. I stood very still. On mine, 4 stitches. On this one, 5. The difference was small enough that I could have missed it the first time, photographed it without seeing it, documented it as identical without actually confirming it stitch by stitch. I hadn't been looking for that level of difference. I'd been looking for confirmation of similarity, not discrepancy within the similarity. I went through the other garments. The green flannel. I examined the collar, where the wear on mine was specific to the right side because of how I carry my head. The flannel in the drawer had wear on both sides, evenly. The brown corduroys had the worn knee patch on the left, the same as mine, but also a faint worn area on the right thigh that mine didn't have. Small. The kind of thing that happens from a particular sitting posture maintained over time. The garments were not copies, or they were not only copies. They were copies that had diverged. Things made to match me that had then been lived in. Worn by something that did not sit or move or carry its weight the same way I did. Something that was approximating me well enough to replicate the major details, but imperfectly enough that its own physical habits were beginning to show in the fabric. I folded everything back. I closed the drawer. I walked through the storage wing into the main hall and through to the third gallery. The lights were on their evening setting, dimmed for after hours. I walked to the outdoor figure. It was wearing a jacket I recognized, a dark navy fleece I'd been wearing 2.5 weeks ago, before the weather turned. I'd already logged the discrepancy when I found its standard documentation. Undocumented garment. Listed coat not present. The listed coat was in the archive drawer. What I hadn't done yet was examine the fleece closely, because I'd been keeping my distance, in a way I was only now acknowledging to myself. I examined it now. The zipper pull was missing on the museum version. On mine, the zipper pull had broken off about a year ago, and I'd replaced it with a small carabiner clip, the kind that comes on a keychain. Bright silver, about 1 inch long. On the museum version, there was no carabiner, just the bare zipper slider, which meant the copy had been made before I'd replaced the pull, or it had been made without access to that detail, or the detail was simply not present yet, on whatever version of me the garments belonged to. I thought about that carefully, what it implied. A version that was slightly behind. That hadn't gotten to the carabiner yet. That still sat with its weight distributed differently than I did. Still carried its head in a way that hadn't worn the collar the same way mine had. Still had 5 overstitches on the pocket flap, where I had 4. Not a copy of my present self. A copy that was catching up. I looked at the figure's face in the dim gallery light. The glass eyes had shifted further since the morning I was nearly certain of it, though I didn't have today's measurements to compare yet. The angle of the head was different. The left shoulder was lower than I remembered it being. The posture was different. I looked at the figure's posture, and then I stood up straight and let my own posture go natural, the way it settles when you stop thinking about it. My left shoulder lower, an old habit from years of working on one side, my weight slightly back on my heels. The figure's weight was forward, on the balls of its feet. Not my posture, not yet. I left the building. I locked up, set the alarm, drove home. I didn't listen to the radio. In my room, I opened my laptop and the private file, and I typed everything I'd found. The extended thread, the divergent stitching, the collar wear, the absent carabiner, the posture. I typed it all plainly without interpretation, because I wasn't ready to write the interpretation yet. But I knew that if I read it all together from the beginning, the interpretation would be unavoidable. Then I sat at my table and I thought about Marisol. I thought about her specifically because she was the thing I came back to when I needed to hold something fixed. She was real and concrete, and she existed outside of whatever was happening in that museum, and whatever was happening in the storage drawer, and whatever was slowly adjusting its posture in the third gallery while the building was empty. I thought about the craft fair, where she'd bought the patches, which I hadn't been at because Marisol had gone with her mother, and she'd called me afterward to tell me about it. And I'd listened and asked questions. and felt the particular specific ache of having missed an ordinary afternoon. She'd ironed the patches on during the winter visit. I'd sat at her mother's kitchen table and watched her press each one down with a damp cloth and a hot iron, careful about the heat, making sure the edges adhered. She'd done 3-1 on a jacket, 1 on a tote bag, 1 on the orange pullover. She'd pressed the pullover one hard and held the cloth down for a full count of 10 because the cuff fabric wasn't lying flat, and I'd watched her small hands doing that careful, methodical work, and I'd felt something I didn't have a word for at the time. Something adjacent to gratitude. The patch had been on that pullover when whatever was in the museum first replicated it, which meant it had access to that specific moment, or to the object as it existed after that moment. I stopped that line of thought because it didn't lead anywhere I could manage that night. In the morning, I called in late, first time I'd done that, and drove to the university library in the next town, which was 40 minutes east. I wanted to look at something without using the museum's resources, and without anyone asking what I was looking for. I spent 2 hours in the library's local history archive. What I was looking for was the building, the courthouse, not its general history, which I already knew in the broad strokes from the museum's own documentation, built 1891, converted to museum use 1974, various renovations. I was looking for specifics. The third gallery, the area of the third gallery where the figures stood. The library had the original architectural plans on microfilm, which took me 45 minutes to locate. The plans were detailed. The third gallery had been, in its courthouse incarnation, the main deliberation chamber, the room where decisions were made about people. And in the far corner, near what was now the position of the outdoor figure, there had been a holding area, a room within a room, separated by a lattice partition, where people waited before they were brought forward, where people were held before their outcomes were decided. That was probably nothing. Architecture retains its use patterns in ways that feel significant, but rarely are. I wrote it down anyway. What was more useful was a local historical record from 1912, a county newspaper archive, a brief article about a courthouse fire that had been contained before spreading. The fire had started in the north wall of the deliberation chamber, which was the wall the outdoor figure now stood against, and had been attributed to a defective flue in an adjoining chamber. The article mentioned that the fire had caused significant damage to a portion of the court records, and that 2 individuals who had been in the building overnight reported that they had not been able to leave the deliberation chamber for approximately 4 hours, despite the doors being operable. They had not been able to leave. The article described this briefly as a detail of the incident. It did not treat it as remarkable. Perhaps in 1912, it was the kind of thing that was noted and then set aside. I drove back. On the road, I thought about what it means to be held in a space. And then I thought about the figure, always positioned facing the door, and what it would mean if it wasn't oriented toward leaving, but towards the door as a reference point. The way you orient toward a door when you're watching it, when you're waiting for it to open, when you want to know who comes in. I got to the museum at 11:30. Renata was with a school group. Patricia was on a call. I went directly to the third gallery. The figure was wearing something new, something that had not been there that morning when I'd done my rounds before leaving. It was wearing a gray cable-knit cardigan, one I owned, one I'd left on the chair beside my bed that morning when I'd changed my mind about wearing it. I had not worn it to the museum. I had not worn it outside my room that morning. It had been sitting on the chair beside my bed in a room with a locked door when I'd left the building at 8:15 to drive to the university library. The gray cable-knit cardigan on the figure had a small brown stain on the left cuff, just at the edge of the ribbing. Coffee. 3 weeks ago, reaching across my table. I hadn't gotten it out. I'd told myself it was small enough not to matter. The stain was on the figure's cuff. Exact size, exact position. I stood very still for a long time. And then, because I am the kind of person I am, I walked up to the figure and I looked at its face. Directly at it. Closer than I'd ever stood. The glass eyes were positioned. I measured this with my eyes carefully, using the doorframe as a reference at exactly the angle required to see the entrance to the gallery. Not the exit door. The entrance. The figure was not oriented to watch people leave. It was watching for people to arrive. I stepped back, and I noticed, for the first time, something I'd walked past dozens of times and processed without registering. On the display card mounted beside the figure, the small printed card that named the display, the way every figure had one, the text read, Harwick County resident, circa 1890s. Occupation, unknown. Every other figure in the museum had an occupation listed. Postmaster, merchant, homemaker, factory worker, office clerk. This one had always simply said, unknown. I read it again. Then I looked at the figure wearing my cardigan, with my coffee stain on its cuff, watching the door with its glass eyes. I took out my phone, and I called Marisol. It went to voicemail. I stood in the third gallery and listened to her voice on the recording, that particular cadence she had. And when the beep came, I said her name once, and then I said I loved her, and I hung up. I don't know why I called her. I've thought about it since, and the best I can say is that it was the same impulse that makes you check that a door is locked, even when you know you locked it. Not because you believe it's open, because the cost of being wrong is too high to leave unverified. She called back 20 minutes later while I was at my desk writing up the cardigan discrepancy in the official log. I stepped out into the hallway to take it. "You okay?" she said. She could always hear something in the way I said her name. "Yes," I said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "Dad?" "I know. I'm fine. I'm at work. I just wanted to call." She let it sit for a moment, and then she told me about her morning, a biology test she thought she'd done well on, a plan to see a friend that weekend. I listened and made the right sounds and felt the particular relief of her being entirely ordinary and entirely elsewhere. When she said she had to get back to class, I told her to have a good afternoon. "You sure you're okay?" she said again. "I'll call Sunday," I said. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. Then I went back to the log and finished writing down what I'd found. Garment, description, date, time, condition, location of discrepancy, comparison to record sheet. I wrote it the same way I'd written every other entry. Precise, factual, attributed to observation. The documentation was real. Whatever else was happening, the documentation was real, and it was mine, and I was going to keep doing it correctly. That night I made a decision that I want to explain carefully, because it will sound either braver or more foolish than it actually was. I decided to stay in the building overnight. Not because I thought I would catch something, or confront something, or resolve anything by being present. I'd moved past the framework where presence and observation were going to produce answers. I decided to stay because I'd spent 11 weeks watching this from the outside of the hours when it happened, and I understood, by that point, that whatever was occurring in that third gallery was occurring in the space between my departures and my arrivals, and I needed to know what that space held. Not for the documentation, not for Patricia or the police report, for myself. Because there is a version of not knowing that you can carry, and a version that begins to hollow you out from the inside. And I was approaching the second version, and I knew it. I told Patricia I was working late on the grant report. which was not entirely untrue. I did work on it until 7, when she and Renata both left. I said goodnight to them both, with the ease that comes from having told a partial truth, which is the easiest kind to maintain. Dwight had already gone. I locked the front entrance from the inside after Patricia and walked back through the building to my desk. Then I waited. I did not go to the third gallery. I sat at my desk and worked and read, and after a while I made a cup of tea in the small kitchen off the administrative area and sat with it. The building made its sounds. Heat in the pipes, wood in the walls, the occasional distant sound from the street outside that was swallowed quickly by the building's mass. Old buildings absorb sound differently. They hold it rather than reflecting it. The sound of the street reached me muffled and secondary, like something heard from the next room. At about 10, I turned off my desk lamp and sat in the dark. Not as a tactic. I just didn't feel like having the light on anymore. I've sat in the dark alone before, without it meaning anything. This was different. Not frightening in any specific way. More like sitting in a room where a conversation has just ended, and the silence is still shaped by what was said. At 11:40, I walked to the third gallery. I didn't bring a flashlight. The emergency lighting was enough of a low ambient glow from the exit signs and the small LED strips along the baseboard that stayed on for safety reasons, which gave everything a slightly underexposed quality. Shapes and distances correct, color mostly absent. I walked to the far end of the gallery and stood in front of the figure. It was wearing the gray cardigan, the same as that morning. The coffee stain on the left cuff was visible even in the low light, slightly darker than the surrounding fabric. The figure's posture was as it had been. Shoulders uneven, weight forward, glass eyes oriented toward the gallery entrance. I stood directly in front of it and looked at its face. This is the part I've thought about most carefully in the time since, because I want to be accurate about what I experienced, and I also want to be honest about the limits of what I can claim with certainty. The light was low. I had been inside a building alone for several hours. I was not in an entirely ordinary state of mind. But I know what I saw. The figure's eyes had moved. Not dramatically. Not the way things move in films. No sudden sharp turn. A few degrees, no more. Enough that the orientation, which I'd measured and documented and knew with precision, was different. And the difference was that the eyes were no longer pointing at the gallery entrance. They were pointing at me. I stood there. I didn't move and I didn't speak, and I didn't do anything for what I think was a long time. My heart was going. I was aware of that. I didn't look away. Then I said, quietly, and somewhat ridiculously, "I know you're here." Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. I don't know what I thought would happen. The figure stood where it stood, wearing my cardigan, looking at me with glass eyes and bad light. I stood there a while longer. And then, something shifted in me. Not dramatically. Not a revelation. More like the way a muscle finally unclenches after you've been holding it without realizing. I'd been asking the wrong question for 11 weeks. I'd been asking how. How does it know what I'm wearing? How does it replicate the details? How does it get into my room without entering? I'd been treating it as a logistics problem, a mechanism to decode. But I'd found the record from 1912. I'd read about the people who couldn't leave. I'd looked at that display card, occupation, unknown. And I understood that unknown didn't mean unrecorded. It meant something that had never fit any category the museum had available. The question was not how. The question was why me? And why now? And standing in front of a figure that had been dressing itself in incremental copies of my life for nearly 3 months, the question was what it wanted from the process. I thought about the rotation, one garment at a time, Each one returned to the drawer, folded. The divergences in the fabric, the posture wearing differently, the stitching off by one, the collar wear wrong. A copy that was learning me, that was wearing me a little at a time, practicing me in small quantities, returning the garments and making notes the way I made notes, building a file on me the way I'd been building one on it. Not threatening me, studying me. I thought about the holding room, the space where people waited before their outcomes were decided. A space designed for a particular relationship, to time to waiting, to watching the door. I thought about something that had been in that space long enough that the space had become part of it. That watched every person who came through the door of that chamber and noted them and eventually lost interest. Or they left. Or the museum closed around it like a shell forms around an irritant, and it had been here in the quiet for years. And then I'd arrived. I don't know why me specifically. That's the part I can't close. Maybe there was no specific reason. Maybe I was simply the first person in a long time who came every morning and stayed late and moved through the same space repeatedly and had a particular quality of attention, the kind of attention that had spent 20 years looking closely at things, learning their details, maintaining records. Maybe that quality of attention is recognizable to something that practices the same thing. Maybe it was just my turn, and the selecting logic was nothing more than availability. But I thought about one more thing, standing in that gallery, and I thought about it because I couldn't not. The patch on the orange pullover, Marisol's hands pressing the cloth down, counting to 10, making sure the edges held. The figure had replicated the patch, had replicated the evidence of my daughter's care. There was nothing threatening about that, which is what made it the most unsettling detail of all the unsettling details. Whatever was in that room had looked at that patch and understood that it was significant, had included it, had dressed itself in the evidence of my daughter's hands without any apparent understanding of what that meant, and, in not understanding, had gotten closer to the truth of me than anything else it had copied. I looked at the figure for another long moment. Then I said, still quietly, "I'm going to keep coming in." I don't know why I said that either. It wasn't an invitation, and it wasn't a threat. It was just the truth. I was going to keep coming in because this was my job, and I was good at it, and the building needed maintaining, and the objects needed their records kept. And whatever was in that gallery was part of the building, and the building was mine to care for, in the way that a conservator cares for things. Not owning them, not controlling them, but maintaining the conditions for their continued existence. I went back to my desk and slept in my chair for a few hours, and woke up stiff and uncomfortable with the early light coming under the front blinds. I did my rounds. The cardigan was still on the figure. I logged it and went to make tea. A week later, the cardigan was in the drawer, folded, and the outdoor figure was wearing the charcoal gray overcoat over its period costume, correctly recorded on the sheet, everything as it should be. I checked the overcoat carefully and found on the left cuff, inside the sleeve where you'd only find it by reaching in, a single brown thread. Not part of the overcoat's construction. A short length of thread, loose, sitting in the cuff. The same thread I used to repair my canvas work shirt. The same brown that didn't match. I removed it, held it for a moment. Then I put it in the pocket of my trousers and went back to work. I've been at the museum for 14 months now. The incidents happen every 2 to 3 weeks, the same as always. New garments appear, are logged, are studied by Renata and Patricia as unresolved collection anomalies. The police report remains open. The locksmith replaced all the locks. Dwight reconnected the alarm sensor on the east door. None of it made any difference, which I expected. I've stopped trying to explain it to Patricia in new ways. The documentation exists. She's not satisfied by it, and she's not going to be. That's appropriate. She's responsible for a public institution, and what the documentation describes is not something a public institution can formally accommodate. I understand her position. Renata knows more than she says. I've noticed her checking the outdoor figure with a specific quality of attention that she didn't have before. She hasn't asked me anything directly in several months, which means she's arrived somewhere on her own and she's deciding what to do with it. I'll wait for her. The figure's posture has changed gradually over the past few months. The weight is more settled now, more back on the heels. The left shoulder is lower than the right. The glass eyes, on any given morning when I come in, are pointing approximately at the place I'd be standing if I'd just walked through the gallery entrance. 2 months ago, I brought in Marisol's patches. Not the orange pullover, I still wear that. I brought in the jacket she'd patched, one I'd retired because the zipper had finally given out. I donated it to the collection officially, wrote it up properly, gave it a catalog number. It went into the textile archive. 3 weeks later, one of the archived garments in the flat drawer had a small circular patch on the sleeve. Blue and white sailing vessel, applied from the inside, the way you do it if you were working from within. I stood in the storage wing and looked at that for a while. Then I wrote it up and put it in both files, the official one and the private one, and I closed the drawer, and I went to call Marisol because it was a Wednesday. She answered on the second ring. She told me about a college application she was working on, a program in conservation science. She'd gotten interested in it partly, she said, from hearing me talk about restoration work over the years. She wanted to know if I thought she'd like it. I said I thought she'd be very good at it. That's not what I asked, she said. Yes, I said. I think you'd like it. After we hung up, I sat at my desk in the quiet of the museum, and I thought about what it means to maintain something. The distinction I'd drawn that night in the gallery, not owning, not controlling, just maintaining the conditions, keeping the records, making sure nothing is lost that doesn't have to be lost. Outside the window, the town was doing its ordinary afternoon things. Inside, in the third gallery at the end of the hall, something had been in a room for over 100 years, watching the door, learning the people who came through it one borrowed garment at a time. I had a grant report to finish. I turned back to my desk. At the end of the day, I did my rounds the way I always did. Front gallery first, the postmaster. Second gallery, the general store, the domestic scene. Third gallery, tannery worker, office woman at her desk. Then the outdoor figure at the far end, by the wall where a fire had started in 1912 and something had kept 2 people from leaving for 4 hours. The figure was wearing the charcoal overcoat, correctly recorded, nothing anomalous. I initialed the log. I stood in front of it for a moment, the way I sometimes did before leaving. The glass eyes were at my level. The posture was close, getting closer, month by month, to something I recognized. The left shoulder lower, the weight back. The particular way a person stands when they have been doing this a long time, and the work is familiar, and the building is quiet, and there is nowhere else they are supposed to be. I turned off the gallery light and walked back through the museum, and let myself out the front door, and locked it behind me.